Well, I want to begin by picking up on our reading where we left off at the last part of verse 3. And I'm going to read on through verse 6. If for no other reason, I want to make sure that I finish this passage before we finish our times together this week. Basically, halfway through verse 3, he says, "You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived in luxury and self-indulgence, and you have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who are not opposing you." Now, first of all, what he's condemning here is not wealth, but the hoarding of wealth. And the idea behind hoarding is that there's a excessive accumulation just for the sake of accumulating. It's that picture of Ebenezer Scrooge in the Christmas story, where he's just counting his money and storing away more and more money. He has more wealth than he can ever use, he'll ever need. Something that Steve Jobs said, I read in his biography, I thought was real interesting. He said, "After I made my first $50 million, I realized I'd never want for money ever again. And so he said, I stopped thinking about it." I thought that's fascinating, because here he was able to look at it and saying, there's a point where you have more money than you can ever use in your lifetime. I'm not going to be driven by that. I'm going to be driven by what I'm passionate to do. Unfortunately, I don't believe he was a follower of Jesus, and that's honestly is a continual grief to my soul. But nonetheless, it's a perspective that many Christians haven't been able to figure out, because there are many Christians who are so fearful of the future that they seek to accumulate excessively. And I understand that no one can tell. Hyperinflation could come and wipe us all out. With that 5% inflation growth in the last year, which is astounding and frightening, and yet it doesn't seem to be abating. There comes a point, where interest rates, I remember years ago, interest rates hitting on a house purchase 18%. And I decided that it wasn't a prudent time for me to try to buy a house. In fact, nobody could, and the economy went through a terrible downturn. So I understand that the world is unpredictable, but there's the same thing, because we can't predict it. We have to really trust that God is going to guide and direct us. Anybody who can tell you with accuracy what the future is going to bring is really taking liberties that they shouldn't be taking. But at the same time, there's a difference between saving and a prudent storing up and of hoarding. And when we go far past what is prudent and we begin to hoard just because we like the pleasure or the false security of having more than anybody else, then we're getting into a place where we're walking in unbelief and we're not trusting God. But what he really condemns is not only the fact that they were hoarding, but how they hoarded. How did they amass this? And really, when money becomes your God, nothing restrains you, or you're not restrained from doing anything to get more. And that's where he begins to address the issue of dishonest gain. It's disregarding the needs of others in order to enrich ourselves. It's interesting, a famed, probably most famous economist of the 20th century, a guy named Milton Friedman, really had this, I think, very unhealthy effect upon corporations and businesses, because he said the corporation only has one responsibility, and that's to the shareholder. So basically, corporate leaders began to say, I don't have to worry about the greater impact. All I got to worry... All I have to worry about is the quarterly reports that show that I have been successful in building the business. And they put conscience away, and really it opened the door for some of the most successful people in the world of business and politics today, I think, are basically sociopathic personalities. They have delusions of grandeur on one hand, and they have no empathy for other people. And that was justified through Friedman's teaching. And I although he is lionized by many people in the economic world, I think this was just a diabolical concept to insert into the mindset of the American society. But here is really what he gets at, talking about a lacking of generosity, when he says you've lived in luxury and self-indulgence. In the original language, that's actually just one word. And it means in the original to indulge yourself excessively in satisfying one's own appetites and desires, in a self-absorptive way. In other words, this is a person who only concerns himself with enriching himself. He doesn't care what happens to other people. One of the things I think that we have to take away from all of this is that prosperity carries with it responsibility. Responsibility first to God, that we're responsible to honor God with our monies. And, I don't want to say a lot about it, but I learned years ago to give God 10% off the top, not off the bottom or even the middle, off the top, the first thing. Even if what I came in didn't seem to be enough to meet my needs, I viewed that as being God's. That belongs to him. It's God gave this to me, and I'm going to honor God with what he gave me. And I think that that's where I've been amazed over the years that God is, the 90% I was left with went much further than if I had kept the 100% for myself. God suddenly grows that 90%. And I think that's where we have to understand. We have an honor to God. We have an honor, secondly, to care for our families. Before we give or care for any other people, we need to make sure that we are caring for our own family, our own loved ones. As the old saying goes, charity begins at home. Actually, Paul says essentially that in 1 Timothy 5. So we have to honor God with our monies. And secondly, we need to honor or provide for our families. But thirdly, we also need to honor the poor. And I think that part of the thing we should be concerned with is that we can help people rebuild their lives in a constructive way. But I would say at the same time, when you do that, do it wisely. There are many benevolent organizations that are involved in feeding people who are homeless or poor or so forth. And I had one gentleman who ran an organization like this, and he told me, he said, we came to the point where we realized that all we were doing is enabling their bad behavior. We're fortunate locally. Our local gospel mission has really figured this out and has done a tremendous job in helping people in addiction and poverty to get out of those conditions, but by putting them into an accountability system and a program that both provides for them and supports them, but gives them skills and trains them. It's really a marvelous ministry. So if you have ministries like that in your community, those are things that are worthwhile supporting. But beware of the fact that, I had somebody tell me that they went, downtown Seattle with all this food, with excesses from restaurants that they were going to throw out, and they were giving it to the poor, basically made the homeless. And he said, some of the people were just coming up and saying, what do you have? And they'd show them, they say, I don't want that. You got any of this? Or you got any of that? And I thought, as a friend of mine used to say, or one of my pastors used to say, a starving man doesn't argue wheat or rye. And so we find that many of these people are so accustomed to living on the dole that they don't understand or even appreciate what's being done. In fact, they feel like it's owed to them. You're not helping people in that situation. So we have a responsibility to help the poor, but I would also say the guy who's standing in the corner with a sign saying, give me some money, I never give those guys money because I know that most of them, if not the vast majority of them, are con men. And because I think anybody with a certain degree of self-respect wouldn't be doing that. Anyway, I better stop there because that's going to be more than I want to talk about. But anyway, I thank you for following along. I hope the things I've shared about the issues of money and riches and stuff has been helpful, because this is an area where, living in the most prosperous nation in the world, we have unique challenges in that regard. And it's not going to one extreme or the other, but it's finding the balance. I don't want you to live without regard to other people, nor do I want you going around in robes and barefoot because you're taking a vow of poverty. Both extremes, I think, are silly and foolish, if not destructive. We need to be normal people living normally, but also being prudent in how we use that. We honor God, we honor our families, we honor those who are in need, and we see that the resources we received are given to us for that purpose. So, hope this has been good for you this week. I've enjoyed it. God bless you and go in His grace.